Hey Kirsten, it's Dr. Renfro. I wanted to make this video a little bit more long form because you asked quite a few really good questions. And I thought, what a great way to respond and explain these things in a little bit more detail in case I was a little bit unclear. So I titled this short video Philosophy and Religion, and I'm going to hopefully try to answer the questions that you asked in your video. So, first, you ask about philosophy and religion's connection, and there seemed to be some sort of implicature that philosophy was almost like a religion, or that there was some sort of connection in one's philosophical analysis and one's way of life. Well, we need to remember that philosophy's often been called the handmaid or handmaiden of religion, right? Because what is philosophy? It's a method of questioning and analysis directed towards seeking the truth and finding out what the ultimate nature of reality is. Now, what that is an objectively true answer, right? The nature of reality, there is some objectively true answer. But until we develop the scientific methods to verify or the historic methods of analysis to analyze or the philosophical methods to definitively prove the nature of reality, right? Until we develop those things, then all we're left with is this method of questioning and analysis, right? A lot of people think that philosophy is just a lot of navel gazing or looking up at the clouds, pontificating about nothing, but it really is directed towards finding the truth. And it uses different methods. Sometimes it uses the same methods as science. Sometimes it uses the methods of mathematics. Sometimes it uses the methods of history, right? It is an overarching thing which builds the frameworks out of which many other things operate. Now, we got to remember religion is something different. It is a divinely revealed set of doctrines, beliefs, truths about the world that may or may not cohere to the objective reality, right? So you've got religion on this side that says, for example, in the Judeo-Christian position, God reveals these things in the Bible, and this is the truth. And then on the other side, you've got philosophy that is seeking for truth. And sometimes philosophy will work with religion to help justify the truth presented in religion. Sometimes it might work in opposition, right? It just depends on the perspective of the person asking the questions, what their goals are, because there are things in faith, in religion, that you have to take on faith. You have to, use some evidence and analysis to believe, right? Because if you didn't do that, that'd be crazy. And it doesn't matter the religion, right? Whether it's, Christianity, paganism, Buddhism, whatever. You have to have some element in there that you, as the believer, can comport to reality, right? And then what philosophy does is it takes those areas that comport to reality and either helps expand them or helps, divine or analyze new ways which it might comport, right? But we want to be sure that we're not, thinking that everything is philosophy. So, for example, within, again, the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a long history of historians doing historical analysis on the Bible and on some of the early church text to determine if, the things described within happened in actuality, right? So there's this long historical tradition. History is not philosophy. Then there's the scientific side, right? The Catholic Church, for example, has a team of people that go out. Say there's a Eucharistic miracle that's performed, right? A Eucharistic miracle is where, through some means or method, the communion wafer has started to transform into like flesh or blood, or the wine has started to become blood, right? Well, the Catholic Church, they have a whole team of investigators that go out to try and disprove that. Scientists, engineers, medical doctors, philosophers, scholars, anyone that could try and disprove it. They go into a miracle trying to find that it is false, trying to prove that it is false. And it is only when their scientific analysis fails that they have to declare it, that they declare it a miracle, right? But all that I described is not philosophy. That is a scientific method. It's a scientific type of analysis. Which leads us to the next question. Suppose someone changes religion. Is that a practice of philosophy? So if you go from Christian to pagan or pagan to Christian because you didn't like certain rules about your religion or you weren't able to scientifically prove things, were you having a religious or a philosophical journey? Well, you were having a religious journey, but you were using some of the methods of philosophy. You also might have been using the methods of history. You might have also been using the methods of mathematics, right? You know, say I believe in a religion that doesn't believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and I don't believe in the American Revolution, right? Like these things never happened. Well, if I, open up a math book and I see that 2 + 2 does equal 4, well, then I have, used mathematics, right? Or if I look in a history book and I see that the American Revolution did happen, well, then I used a historical method, right? So what about if you are doing analysis on your values and structural idea analysis, and you're, comparing these scientific and religious and historical ideas together and trying to form a coherent worldview, well, then you're using a tool of philosophy, but you are having a religious journey, right? So the end goal is you're having a religious journey. Now, when we talk about not being able to scientifically prove some things in a religion or not liking certain rules, depending on what the religion is, there are some facts that, would just exist outside the realm of science, right? So within Christianity, there's only a few core doctrines one must believe in to be a Christian. The Trinity, that is that you've got God the Father, Christ the Son, Holy Spirit, and they are all one, even though they're multiple components, right? That is something that you can't perform a scientific test to prove, right? Are you going to put God under a microscope? I mean, if you could, he wouldn't be God, right? Like by definition, a God would have to exist outside of our realm so that we could not harm or injure a God, right? That's just like a definitional thing, right? Or the fact that Christ, came to earth and, was crucified and rose from the dead. Well, that's something you can't test with science, right? Like, if he rose from the dead, then by definition his body is not there to be, analyzed, right? Like, just by definition. So you can't perform a scientific analysis on that. The only thing you can do is perform a historical analysis, right? You could say, look at the earliest religious documents and non-religious documents you have and see if there are talks of someone, named the Christ who was crucified and perhaps came back from the dead. See if there is evidence of people risking their life to testify that this person rose from the dead. If those things do not exist, then, you have made a strong case. Otherwise, that's, you can't test that scientifically. That's a historic question, right? That's a history question. So that's one of the issues. A lot of religious questions aren't really scientific. Now, of course, there are scientific questions that are comported in religion, such as, um, you know, evolution, right? If someone is a young Earth creationist and believes the Earth is only 6,000 years old, well, that's insane, right? Like, we have valid scientific tools that can disprove that, right? But what about the story of the burning bush, right? Moses up on top of the mountain receiving God as a burning bush. What scientific test can you use to determine that? Or like a worldwide flood. It seems very unlikely that there was ever a worldwide flood. And we can scientifically test for that. We know there was a point in prehistory prior to the evolution of humans that there was, massive amounts of water basically covering the earth. But humans wouldn't have been around for that to flood them. That wouldn't have happened. So yeah, that's a scientific question. But what about what about Christ's teachings on top of the Mount, his Sermon on the Mount? Where he says, turn the other cheek, or practice forgiveness, or things of that nature. That's not something that you can scientifically test. That's a moral question, right? So when it comes to these questions of religion, being able to scientifically test them can only answer part of it, but it can answer other parts. And invariably, some of the most important parts are the parts that just by definition can't be scientifically tested. And just on a side note, comments about not liking certain rules of religions or whatever, well, I mean, that kind of comes with the territory, right? Like, the goal of a religion is to guide and direct people down a certain path, right? Like the Taoists call it going along the way, right? You're going to go down the path, and that's what the rules are there. I mean, truthfully, no one likes rules. I don't like rules. I hate rules. But, that's what it's there for. It helps bring order to a chaotic humanity, right? So if a person likes or doesn't like them, that is a valid reason for complaint, and it could be a valid reason to try and seek other religions. But that's not really a philosophical issue. That's a matter of personal taste, right? And that leads to our final question, is religion scientific? Well, like I said before, there are parts of different religions that you could check scientifically. But most of religion is not scientific. The most important parts of religion are not scientific, right? So I, am not a scholar of religion. I do not know a whole lot about all the different religions of the world. So I can only speak from my own perspective, which is a Judeo-Christian perspective, right? There are aspects of, biblical history or biblical writings that we can test scientifically, right? We can test the age of the earth. We can test if there was some sort of flood. We can test ancient sites, using modern archaeology techniques to see, if there were great battles there, like talked about in the text, or, to see if there were perhaps people living prior to the time of Christ following the Masoretic laws, the Hebrew Bible, following these different texts, rules described, right? Like, there are all those things that we can test. But the most important parts are things that we cannot test. How do I treat my neighbor? What should be the most important thing in my life? How should I structure my life to be a good person, be a valuable member of society, to live in a good way? Those are not questions that you can answer with science. They're very important questions. They're questions that we look in and we do some philosophical analysis on ourselves. We look at our values, right? But those aren't scientific questions. Just by definition, they're not scientific questions. And you can't answer them in a scientific way. So, is religion scientific? No. There are parts of it that are, but there are also parts of it that are historic. There are parts of it that are artistic. There are parts of it that are educational, right? Like, that there are all these different things, but scientific is only a part of them, right? So if you are basing important religious decisions off of only the factors that can be scientifically verified, well, then you are going to be left out in the cold a lot, because most religious teachings and practices can't be verified with science. There are some that can, but not all of them. So, is religion scientific? Not really. Parts of it are. Is religion philosophical? Sometimes, but not always. If we have a religious experience, is that a philosophical thing or a religious thing? It's a religious thing using philosophical methods. What is philosophy? It's a method of, analysis and truth finding, right? But, I wrap all these things up to say that you brought up some very good questions, and it brought me a lot of joy to really think about them and analyze them. And I really appreciate you doing that. So, Kirsten, thank you so much for asking these questions and giving me the time to really think about them. I hope you have a wonderful day.